Oil from Russia has reportedly arrived in the Philippines. According to Bloomberg, Petron CEO Ramon Ang confirmed the receipt of the shipment.
Agaran, pinakamabilis at direktang mararamdaman ng ordinaryong Pilipino, hindi bukas, hindi sa susunod na linggo, ngayon.
Whoever controls the sea lanes controls commerce. Whoever controls commerce shapes prosperity. Alfred Tayarmahan, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. The arrival of 142,000 barrels of diesel in Luzon is clear good news at a time of rising fuel uncertainty. This shipment, about 22.58 million liters, is reported as the first state-procured diesel delivery intended to strengthen supply buffers as global oil markets remain unstable due to tensions in the Middle East. For many Filipinos already facing rising pump prices, the docking of this tanker signals that authorities are moving early to secure supply and prevent sudden shortages from spreading into transport, food delivery, and daily business activity. For an island economy like the Philippines, fuel deliveries are not routine. They are essential to keeping the economy moving. The shipment strengthens reserves that had been tightening and shows the government's willingness to step in when global supply chains become uncertain. Still, the numbers also remind policymakers of a simple reality. With national demand running high each day, one shipment provides relief, but only for a limited period. Stability depends on continued arrivals, careful planning, and stronger reserves, not single deliveries. And this is where the situation begins to widen, because the diesel arrival was only the first step. The story now moves into the declaration of emergency measures, the global disruptions that triggered them, and the wider economic pressures that followed across the Philippines and beyond.
Agaran, pinakamabilis at direktang mararamdaman ng ordinaryong Pilipino, hindi bukas, hindi sa susunod na linggo, ngayon.
On March 24, 2026, President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. declared a national energy emergency, marking a clear shift from normal fuel management to direct government action. This decision came as the country's fuel reserves dropped to about 45 days of supply, down from roughly 57 days earlier in the crisis. The Philippines imports nearly 98% of its oil, much of it tied to Middle Eastern supply routes, making it highly vulnerable to disruptions linked to the ongoing conflict in the region. The emergency order was expected to last up to 1 year, allowing the government to act quickly to secure fuel and maintain supply stability. In practical terms, the emergency changed how fuel was managed nationwide. A special government committee was formed to monitor the supply and distribution of fuel, food, and other essential goods. Authorities were allowed to fast-track procurement, crack down on hoarding and profiteering, and prepare financial support for affected sectors. Reports showed that rising fuel prices had already triggered transport protests, while airlines began reviewing or reducing flights to conserve fuel. Some malls also shortened operating hours, and by March 27th, about 425 fuel stations nationwide had temporarily closed due to rising costs and supply pressure. The broader lesson from this period is simple and practical. When fuel supply tightens, the effects spread quickly across daily life. Diesel powers buses, trucks, farms, and factories. So when reserves shrink, food prices rise, transport becomes expensive, and business activity slows. The declaration of the energy emergency was therefore not only a policy decision, but a response to visible pressure across the economy. It showed that fuel stability is closely tied to economic stability, and when supply becomes uncertain, governments are forced to step in, not as a choice, but as a necessity to keep everyday life running. The Persian Gulf is not merely a region of oil, it is a region upon which the industrial world depends. Karl Haushofer, Writings on Continental Resource Zones. The crisis now unfolding did not begin in Southeast Asia. It began far away, in the narrow waters of the Strait of Hormuz, where nearly 20% of the world's oil supply normally passes each day. In late February and throughout March 2026, military escalation involving Iran and Western forces turned this waterway into a zone of uncertainty. By early March, tanker traffic through Hormuz had dropped sharply, falling by roughly 70% at first and, in some cases, approaching near zero movement as ships waited outside the strait rather than risk attack. At least 12 merchant vessels were damaged, and more than 150 ships were forced to anchor outside the region, creating one of the most serious energy disruptions in modern history. Oil markets reacted immediately. Prices surged past $100 per barrel, reaching peaks near $126 per barrel in March 2026. Levels not seen in years. Insurance costs for tankers rose sharply, and major shipping companies temporarily suspended transit routes. Even large commercial vessels hesitated to cross the strait, and some ships attempting passage turned back due to safety risks. The situation created what analysts described as the largest disruption to global energy supply since the 1970s oil shocks, a comparison that carries heavy historical meaning. Karl Haushofer, writing about resource zones and continental blocks, warned that modern economies depend heavily on concentrated sources of energy located in specific regions. In his view, when a resource zone becomes unstable, its shock spreads outward like ripples in water. The Persian Gulf represents exactly such a zone, rich in resources but narrow in its export routes. When Hormuz tightens, economies thousands of kilometers away feel the pressure. That is why this crisis is not only military or political, it is economic in the deepest sense. The fuel shortages seen in Asia and Southeast Asia are not isolated events, they are consequences of a disruption at the very center of the global energy system. At this point, the thinking of John Maynard Keynes becomes equally relevant. In the general theory of employment, interest, and money, Keynes argued that when markets face sudden shocks, governments must intervene to stabilize demand and maintain economic confidence. That is exactly what many governments began doing in March 2026, releasing emergency reserves, subsidizing fuel where possible, and preparing fiscal support measures to prevent economic slowdown. The logic is straightforward. When energy prices spike, transportation costs rise, inflation accelerates, and consumer spending weakens. Without intervention, a supply crisis quickly becomes a demand crisis. There is also a historical rhythm to these events. The 1970s oil crisis forced nations to rethink energy security, diversify suppliers, and create strategic reserves. The present disruption in Hormuz carries echoes of that period. The difference today is scale. Modern economies consume far more fuel, supply chains are more interconnected, and disruptions travel faster across continents. The Middle East crisis, therefore, should not be seen as a distant regional conflict. It is the trigger point of a global economic chain reaction, one that has reshaped shipping patterns, increased costs across industries, and forced governments to step into markets more actively than they have in years. The strength of a state rests ultimately on its economic foundations. Paul Kennedy, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers.
Well, emergency fuel supplies are heading to Australia from the US, the first time in decades.
The pressure spreading across Europe shows how quickly fuel disruptions turn into industrial strain. Through March 2026, rising oil and gas prices pushed inflation higher across several European economies, forcing energy-heavy sectors such as steel, fertilizer, and manufacturing to slow production or absorb rising costs. Governments responded by releasing parts of their strategic reserves while reconsidering strict climate timelines, choosing short-term survival over long-term planning. Paul Kennedy's observation fits well here. When economic pressures build faster than available resources, even strong industrial systems begin to feel the weight. Across Asia, the concern is even sharper because of heavy reliance on Middle Eastern energy. Major importers like Japan and South Korea, which depend on the Middle East for around 90–95% of their crude oil, began drawing from emergency reserves and negotiating longer alternative shipping routes as uncertainty around Hormuz continued into March. These longer routes increased delivery costs and shipping time, raising fuel prices across markets. This reflects what Jeffrey Sachs explained in The End of Poverty. Modern economies depend on predictable supply systems. And when those systems weaken, the cost of development and daily economic activity rises quickly. The Philippines, however, carries the heaviest daily burden among these regions because its dependence is deeper and its safety margins are thinner. The country imports nearly all of its petroleum, leaving little room to absorb external shocks. As global prices climbed through March, transport costs surged, pushing inflation upward and affecting food distribution, public transport fares, and business operations. Limited refining capacity has added further strain, making the country more dependent on imported finished fuel rather than locally processed supply. Reports of hundreds of smaller fuel stations facing closures or supply shortages highlight how quickly global disruptions translate into local hardship. For ordinary households and small businesses, the crisis is no longer a distant headline. It is visible at fuel pumps, in transport fares, and in the rising cost of daily goods. Oil has shaped the destiny of nations and the daily lives of ordinary people more than almost any other commodity. Daniel Yergin, The Prize, the epic quest for oil, money, and power. When fuel becomes scarce, the first signs of pressure appear inside the economy, and soon after, in politics. Rising fuel prices feed directly into inflation, lifting the cost of transport, food, and basic goods. In many fuel-dependent economies, even a small increase in diesel prices quickly spreads into bus fares, delivery costs, and farm operations. This creates frustration among transport workers and small businesses whose earnings shrink as operating costs rise. The logic described by Robert Gilpin in War and Change in World Politics and Susan Strange in States and Markets helps explain this pattern. Economic stress weakens confidence in markets, and governments are pushed to step in more actively to stabilize prices and prevent disorder. Over time, if shortages continue, the risk grows that economic pressure turns into political pressure, especially in urban areas where fuel shortages are felt immediately. In response, countries begin adapting, sometimes quietly, sometimes urgently. Governments look for alternative suppliers, renegotiate contracts, and expand fuel stockpiles to reduce future vulnerability. Some explore new partnerships with producers outside their traditional networks, while others strengthen regional cooperation to ensure shared access during emergencies. This adjustment reflects the geo-economic thinking outlined by Paul Kennedy, who showed how energy decisions are rarely just technical. They are strategic choices that shape long-term national stability. In recent months, several countries, including the Philippines, have explored non-traditional supply options and increased procurement planning to avoid sudden shortages. These steps are not signs of weakness, but of adaptation to a shifting global environment. Looking ahead, the larger question is not only how to survive the present shortage, but how the global energy system itself may change. Countries may move toward energy nationalism, prioritizing domestic reserves and tighter control over imports. Others may accelerate renewable energy investment, while some delay transitions due to immediate survival needs. Maritime routes and narrow choke points will remain under scrutiny, as their stability determines whether fuel moves smoothly or stalls. The long-term outcome of this crisis will depend on how governments balance economics with planning. Because in the world of energy, the choices made during crisis years often define stability for decades to come. Energy transitions are never quiet. They reshape markets, alliances, and expectations. Daniel Yergin, The Prize. In the months ahead, the world will likely move through waves of instability before settling into a new pattern of supply and cooperation. In the short term, price volatility and sudden supply disruptions will remain common, forcing governments to intervene quickly to protect transport, food systems, and public confidence. In the medium term, countries will work to diversify suppliers, expand reserves, and adjust industries to operate more efficiently under uncertain fuel conditions. Over the long term, global energy alliances will shift, regional blocs will strengthen, and competition over maritime routes will quietly shape the direction of trade and development. The lesson from this moment is simple and enduring. The diesel ship that reached Luzon was not just carrying fuel, it carried time. And in geopolitics and economics alike, time is often the most valuable resource a nation can secure. If you found this analysis valuable, share your perspective in the comments. Your insights help deepen the conversation and sharpen our understanding of evolving regional dynamics. Thank you, and we will see you soon in our next geopolitical discussion.